Thanks for joining us for this week's edition of France in Focus. This week, we're examining a new government initiative which is set to see the policy surrounding immunisations tightened. And it's going to become mandatory for parents to inoculate their children against 11 different illnesses. That's 8 more than the current number. Well, as that policy was unveiled this summer, the French Prime Minister said it is unacceptable that in this day and age, children are still dying of illnesses like measles in this, the very country where some of the first inoculations were developed.
In the 18th century, smallpox was one of the leading causes of death around the world. Desperate families went to extreme measures to protect themselves. In China, women infected their children with dried-up smallpox pus in the hopes that they develop a harmless virus rather than a deadly disease. Then, in 1796, this man changed the course of history. Edward Jenner, a British rural doctor, observed that milkmaids in regular contact with pox-infected cows didn't contract the disease. He then carried out a radical experiment.
Jenner est médecin et il va avoir...
Jenner was a doctor and he had the audacity to inject the pus of a cow into a little boy and then inject him with the variola virus to see if he developed smallpox. This would obviously be completely illegal today.
This method became known as variolation and later vaccination, and it bore its fruits. The little boy never contracted the disease, and the results of the experiment propelled world leaders at the time to launch widespread campaigns for vaccinations. A century later, in Paris, Frenchman Louis Pasteur discovered germ theory, that infectious diseases are caused by viruses and bacteria. He found a way to make these elements less contagious so they could be used for vaccination. In 1881, he founded a vaccine against rage. It was the first in a long series of medical breakthroughs.
Pasteur s'attaque en fait à l'ensemble des maladies infectieuses.
Pasteur took on all infectious diseases. He contributed to a large germ database that aimed to attribute a germ to each existing disease.
C'est donc une entreprise de longue durée.
He led tireless work that he hoped would lead to the eradication of viral diseases.
Rien de moins que l'éradication des maladies infectieuses.
In 1921, the BCG virus was developed for tuberculosis. A vaccine for yellow fever came 6 years later, and then in 1954, a vaccine for polio. But there were some controversies. In 1930, around 80 newborns in Germany died after being accidentally infected with TB during their vaccine. The Lübeck disaster created tensions with France, which exported the vaccine. Some countries have made vaccines compulsory, others haven't. The World Health Organization largely stays out of it, except in emergencies. From its beginnings, though, the issue of vaccinating has always been controversial. And when it comes to infecting to protect, the issue continues to divide society, even today.
Well, as we've been saying, 3 vaccinations are currently mandatory here in France, with the others, such as mumps and whooping cough, being simply recommended by the health authorities. But let's take a closer look now and see just what all these vaccinations are for.
3 vaccines are currently mandatory for French children against diphtheria, tetanus, and polio. They're injected together in the so-called DDP vaccine, and children can't attend school without getting them. 8 other vaccines are recommended but are not mandatory against whooping cough or viral infections like measles, mumps, and rubella, which are very contagious. The government plans to add them to the list in January, bringing the number of mandatory vaccines to 11. While the increase appears significant, it won't change much for 70% of toddlers who already get those extra shots. France is tightening its immunization policy, and it's already one of the few European countries to have mandatory vaccines. Only 10 member states like Italy, Greece, and most Eastern countries push parents to administer DDP to their babies. More than 40% of French families say they're wary of vaccines. It'll be up to the government to convince them of the merits of immunizing their children.
As things stand right now, about 70% of small children here in France are already vaccinated against those illnesses without it being a legal requirement. But according to surveys, a sizable percentage of the French population doesn't trust vaccines, and they're also concerned that the risks outweigh the benefits.
These protesters are angry that the government is forcing many more vaccinations on their children that they say are unsafe and unnecessary.
I don't think we're going to vaccinate our children against 11 diseases. It's insane.
Others are against vaccination altogether.
If a child's immune system is strong enough, that's fine. But otherwise, it's like we're poisoning them.
The anti-vaccination movement is growing in France, especially with the influence of online conspiracy theories. With a simple search, those who are already unsure about the safety of vaccinations will find plenty of sites that back up their fears. And it's not only online conspiracy theorists who are raising concerns. The oncologist, Professor Henri Joyeux, has long been campaigning against what he says are toxic levels of aluminium in vaccines. His doubts have added weight to the anti-vaccine movement.
Vaccines are made to exploit people. Not everyone needs them. We're in the process of forcing people to have vaccinations that are totally pointless, only because there's big money and big people behind it.
But most doctors say that if a large number of parents decided not to vaccinate their children, it would pose a danger to public health.
There are people today who are more afraid of the vaccinations than of the disease, because they're no longer exposed to it. They don't remember it. They've never caught it, thanks to vaccines. All the infectious diseases will return if we stop vaccinating. In 2012, measles caused 30 deaths in France.
One of the 8 new compulsory jabs is to protect children against meningitis, the illness that took the life of 18-year-old Aurélien when an epidemic hit the city of Lille. His parents say they were never told a meningitis vaccination exists.
If you don't want to make it compulsory, that's fine, but then at least tell us that the vaccine exists. No one told us, not even the family doctor.
More research will be done on the potential dangers and side effects of so many injections in France, but those in favour of them would point out that the diseases themselves pose a real threat that can be far more devastating.
Well, for more on this debate, I'm joined now by science journalist Lise Barniot. Thank you very much indeed for coming to speak to us.
You're welcome.
Let me start by asking you, what is your position on the issue of vaccinations? Can you understand why a parent would be worried about these injections? And if so, where do you think that worry comes from?
Of course I understand. I'm a mother myself, so I wrote this book both as a mother and as a journalist specialized in science. And of course these questions are understandable and legitimate. Again, a 3-month-old baby has mostly been coddled and cared for. And then comes a vaccination, which is the first intentional act that causes our children pain. And we inject them with pathogens and other chemical compounds. Take aluminum, for example. A tiny portion of the population conserves aluminum from vaccinations at the injection site. So today, people debate whether or not the aluminum remains only where the scar forms, almost like a tattoo, or whether it spreads throughout the body, including the brain, causing symptoms like chronic fatigue, muscle weakness, or memory problems. It's a hypothesis that certain researchers, especially Romain Guérardi in France, are considering. He has proof of it in his tests on animals, but not yet for humans.
Romain Guérardi en France, il a des preuves au niveau chez l'animal, il n'a pas de preuves chez l'homme.
So what we can say, and it's important to emphasize this, is that when we get into the details of this controversy, we realize first that only a tiny % of the population is concerned by it, and second, that it's probably people who are predisposed to having difficulty expelling aluminum from their bodies. And I think we'll start to see studies that show this. So what I mean is, when we go into detail, we end up being reassured, and it's the unknown that causes all of the doubt, which is certainly overstated.
And right across the globe, and it's not unique to France, but the whole idea of big pharma and people being afraid of pharmaceutical companies and wary of pharmaceutical companies, is that a trend that's also applicable here in France? Do you think people here are also worried?
So, regarding the 11 vaccinations, first I should emphasize that 80 to 90% of infants already get them. So, in practice, the fact that they are now required won't change much in France. They are the ones that are the most routinely used. And out of these 11 vaccinations, only those against pneumococcal infections and hepatitis B are a source of profit. The others, diphtheria, tetanus, polio, or whooping cough, aren't very lucrative vaccinations for the pharmaceutical industry. And only a handful of the industry are involved in manufacturing them.
Thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us, Lise Barniot, science journalist. Thank you so much. And that's it for this week's edition. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and I hope I'll see you again soon on France 24.